Air truck driver faced the Mafia boss. Nothing was the same after that. This is the story of how a single moment of courage on a rain-soaked highway in Tennessee changed everything for a man who had spent his entire life avoiding trouble. His name was Marcus Webb, 42 years old, with calloused hands from years of gripping the wheel of his 18-wheeler and a heart that had grown quiet after losing his wife to illness 3 years before. He drove the long routes between Memphis and Nashville, sometimes stretching all the way to Atlanta, carrying cargo that paid the bills and filled the silence that had become his closest companion. The night everything changed started like any other. The rain came down in sheets across Interstate 40, the kind of relentless downpour that turned the highway into a river of reflected headlights and brake lights. Marcus had been driving for 12 hours straight, his eyes burning with fatigue, when he saw the black SUV swerving across the lanes ahead. Something was wrong. The vehicle moved erratically, almost desperately, before veering off the road and crashing into the guardrail with a sound that cut through even the thunder. Marcus pulled his truck to the shoulder without thinking. His instincts, the ones that had kept him alive through decades of highway driving, told him to keep going, to call 911 and let the professionals handle it. But something else, something deeper that he had buried along with his wife's memory, pushed him out into the rain. He ran toward the wreckage, his boots splashing through puddles that soaked him to the bone within seconds. What he found inside that SUV would haunt him for the rest of his life, but not in the way he expected. There was a woman in the driver's seat, young, maybe late 20s, with dark hair plastered to her face and eyes wide with terror. In the back seat, a little girl, no more than 5 or 6, crying silently, her small hands gripping the headrest in front of her, and on the passenger side a man who was clearly not there to help them. He had a grip on the woman's arm that spoke of control, not concern, and when he saw Marcus appear at the window, his expression shifted from surprise to something cold and calculating. Marcus did not know it yet, but that man was connected to one of the most powerful criminal organizations on the East Coast. And the woman he was trying to take was not just any woman. She was Elena Caruso, the estranged daughter of a legitimate businessman who had unknowingly married into a family whose wealth came from sources that never appeared on any tax return. The little girl was Sophia, her daughter, the one pure thing in a world that had grown darker with each passing year. The rain hammered against Marcus's back as he assessed the situation in a matter of seconds. The man in the passenger seat reached for something inside his jacket, but Marcus was faster. Years of loading and unloading heavy cargo had given him strength that belied his weathered appearance. He yanked open the door and grabbed the man's wrist before he could complete his motion, twisting it with a force that sent whatever he was reaching for clattering to the floor of the vehicle. What happened next was chaos. The man fought back, but Marcus had the advantage of leverage and desperation. He was not fighting for himself. He was fighting for the woman whose eyes begged him for help, for the child whose tears mixed with the rain that poured through the open door. The struggle lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When it was over, the man lay unconscious against the dashboard, and Marcus was helping Elena and Sophia out of the wreckage. They ran to his truck, the 3 of them, strangers bound together by circumstance and the primal need for safety. Marcus helped them into the cab, the warmth of the heater a stark contrast to the cold rain that had soaked them all. He did not ask questions, not yet. He just drove, putting as many miles as possible between them and the crashed SUV, between them and whatever danger had been chasing this woman and her child through the Tennessee night. It was only when they reached a truck stop outside of Nashville, the kind of place where no one asked questions and everyone minded their own business, that Elena finally spoke. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, as if she had spent years learning to make herself small and silent. She told Marcus that she was running from her husband's family, that they would never let her go, that she had made a terrible mistake years ago and had been paying for it ever since. She did not give details, and Marcus did not ask for them. Some truths were too heavy to share with strangers, even strangers who had just saved your life. Sophia had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, exhausted by fear and the late hour. Marcus watched them in the dim light of the truck stop parking lot, 2 figures huddled together against a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. He thought of his own wife, of the daughter they had never had, of all the things he had lost and all the things he had stopped hoping for, and in that moment, something shifted inside him. Something that had been dormant for 3 years began to stir. He made a decision that night that would change the course of his life. He told Elena and Sophia that they could stay with him, that he would help them get somewhere safe, that he would not abandon them to whatever darkness was pursuing them. It was a promise made in the heat of the moment, born of compassion and perhaps a touch of that recklessness that comes with having nothing left to lose. But it was a promise he intended to keep. What Marcus did not know was that the man he had left unconscious in that SUV was not just any enforcer. He was the nephew of Dominic Santoro, the head of a criminal empire that stretched from New York to Miami, with tendrils reaching into every major city along the eastern seaboard. And Dominic Santoro did not forgive. He did not forget. And he certainly did not let go of what he considered his property, which, in his mind, included his son's widow and granddaughter. The call came the next morning, while Marcus was getting coffee at a diner just outside of Nashville. His phone, the cheap prepaid one he used for work, buzzed with an unknown number. He almost did not answer, but something told him he should. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, and utterly terrifying in its composure. The man identified himself as Dominic Santoro, and he knew everything. He knew Marcus's name, his truck registration, his route history, his home address in a small town outside of Memphis. He knew about the accident, about the fight, about Elena and Sophia, and he made it very clear that Marcus had exactly 48 hours to return what belonged to him, or there would be consequences that extended far beyond anything Marcus could imagine. Marcus stood in that diner parking lot, the morning sun warming his face, and felt the weight of the choice before him. He could walk away. He could tell Elena that he was sorry, that this was not his fight, that he had his own life to protect. He could return to the lonely roads and the empty apartment, and the silence that had become his only companion. No one would blame him. No one would even know. But when he looked through the window of the diner and saw Eleanor helping Sophia color on a paper placemat, saw the way the little girl's face lit up when she got the colors just right, saw the ghost of a smile on Elena's lips for the first time since he had met her, Marcus knew he could not walk away. Some things were worth fighting for. Some things were worth risking everything for. And maybe, just maybe, this was the purpose he had been searching for ever since his wife had closed her eyes for the last time. He went back inside the diner and sat down across from Eleanor. He told her about the phone call, about Dominic Santoro, about the 48 hours they had been given. He watched her face go pale, watched the hope drain from her eyes, watched her pull Sophia closer, as if she could shield her from the world with her body alone. And then he told her something else. He told her that he was not going to let them take her, that he would find a way to keep her and Sophia safe, that she was not alone anymore. Elena looked at him with an expression that Marcus would never forget. It was a mixture of disbelief and gratitude, and something else, something that looked almost like the first green shoots of trust pushing through soil that had been frozen for far too long. She asked him why. Why would a stranger risk everything for a woman he had just met, for a child who was not his own, for a fight that was not his to fight? Marcus thought about the question for a long moment before answering. He thought about his wife, about the way she had always seen the best in people, about the way she had made him want to be better than he was. He thought about all the times he had looked the other way, all the times he had told himself that it was not his problem, all the times he had chosen safety over courage, and he realized that he was tired. Tired of being careful, tired of being alone, tired of living a life that was more about avoiding pain than seeking joy. He told Elena that he did not have a good reason. He told her that it probably did not make sense. He told her that he was just a truck driver who had spent too many years driving in circles, and that maybe for once he wanted to drive towards something instead of away from it. It was not an eloquent answer. It was not a heroic answer, but it was honest, and Elena seemed to understand. They left the diner together, the three of them, bound by a promise that felt as fragile as it was fierce. Marcus did not know what the next 48 hours would bring. He did not know how they would escape a man whose reach extended across half the country. He did not know if any of them would survive what was coming. But as he helped Sophia into the truck and saw her small hand reach for his, as he felt Elena's fingers brush against his arm in a gesture of silent gratitude, Marcus knew one thing for certain. He had been sleeping for 3 years, going through the motions of a life that had lost its meaning. And now, finally, he was awake. Whatever happened next, he would face it with his eyes open and his heart beating with a purpose it had not felt in far too long. The road ahead was uncertain, dangerous, and possibly fatal, but for the first time in years, Marcus Webb felt alive. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you enjoy stories that remind you what courage really looks like, stories that prove ordinary people can do extraordinary things, then this is where you belong. Subscribe now and become part of a community that believes in the power of hope. Chapter 2. The next 48 hours became a blur of motels with peeling wallpaper and diners where the coffee was always lukewarm and the waitresses never asked questions. Marcus drove east, then north, then west again, deliberately zigzagging across state lines in an attempt to make their trail as confusing as possible. He paid for everything in cash, avoided toll roads, and kept his phone turned off except for brief moments when he needed to check in with the one person he trusted to help them. That person was his brother, Daniel, a former military police officer who now worked as a private security consultant in Chicago. Daniel had always been the smart one, the one who understood how the world really worked beneath its polished surface. When Marcus called him from a payphone outside a truck stop in Kentucky, Daniel listened without interrupting, asked a few pointed questions, and then gave Marcus the kind of advice that only someone who had seen the worst of humanity could give. Daniel told Marcus that running was not going to work. Dominic Santoro had resources that extended far beyond what any ordinary person could imagine. He had contacts in law enforcement, in government, in industries that touched every aspect of American life. If Marcus tried to hide Elena and Sophia through conventional means, they would be found within weeks, if not days. The only way to survive was to go on the offensive, to find something that Santoro valued more than his pride, and to use it as leverage. Marcus asked what that something might be. Daniel paused for a long moment before answering. He said that men like Santoro did not rise to power by being invulnerable. They rose by making enemies, by burying secrets, by accumulating debts that they never intended to pay. Somewhere there was a weak point. Somewhere there was a crack in the armor. The trick was finding it before the 48 hours ran out. Eleanor had been listening from the truck, Sophia asleep on the seat beside her. When Marcus returned and relayed the conversation, she looked at him with an expression that mixed fear with something harder, something that looked almost like determination. She told Marcus that she knew things about her late husband's business, things about Dominic Santoro's operations, things that had been whispered in rooms where she was supposed to be invisible. She had spent years pretending not to notice, not to hear, not to understand. But she had noticed, she had heard, and she understood more than anyone had ever given her credit for. Marcus asked her what kind of things. Elena hesitated, glancing at Sophia to make sure she was still asleep, before speaking in a voice so low that Marcus had to lean close to hear her. She told him about shipments that came through the port of Newark, about payments that flowed through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, about officials who received envelopes every month in exchange for looking the other way. She told him about a warehouse in Philadelphia that served as a hub for everything that could not be explained on paper, and about a safe inside that warehouse that contained records of every transaction Dominic Santoro had ever made. If those records were to fall into the wrong hands, Elena said, Santoro's entire empire would crumble. Not just the criminal parts, but the legitimate businesses he had carefully built to launder his profits. The real estate developments, the restaurant chains, the construction companies that had contracts with 3 different state governments. Everything he had spent decades building would collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. Marcus looked at Elena with new eyes. This was not just a frightened mother running from a dangerous family. This was a woman who had been playing a long game, waiting for the right moment to escape, gathering information like a squirrel gathering nuts for winter. She had been preparing for this, even if she had not known exactly what form it would take. And now, with Marcus's help, she might actually have a chance to use what she knew. The plan came together over the next 24 hours, in hushed conversations at rest stops and hurried phone calls to Daniel. They would go to Philadelphia, to the warehouse Elena had described, and they would get those records. It was insane. It was suicidal. It was the only option they had left. Daniel flew in from Chicago to meet them at a motel just outside the city. He was everything Marcus was not: tall, fit, with the kind of confident posture that came from years of military training. But underneath the differences, the brothers shared the same stubborn determination, the same refusal to back down from a fight that mattered. Daniel looked at Elena and Sophia, at the way they huddled together like survivors of a shipwreck, and Marcus saw something shift in his brother's expression. Daniel understood. Some things were worth fighting for. They spent the next day planning, going over every detail until it was burned into their memories. The warehouse was located in an industrial district near the Delaware River, surrounded by other buildings that had long since been abandoned to rust and decay. It was guarded, but not heavily. Santoro relied on secrecy rather than force to protect his most sensitive operations. Most people did not even know the warehouse existed, and those who did knew better than to talk about it. Elena would stay behind with Sofia, hidden in a safe house that Daniel had arranged through contacts he refused to name. Marcus and Daniel would go to the warehouse together, using credentials that Daniel had obtained through channels that Marcus decided he was better off not knowing about. They would get in, find the safe, retrieve the records, and get out before anyone knew they were there. Simple, clean, terrifyingly risky. The night of the operation was cold and clear, the kind of Philadelphia winter night that made every breath visible and every sound carry further than it should. Marcus sat in the passenger seat of Daniel's rental car, watching the warehouse through binoculars, his heart pounding so loudly that he was certain it could be heard from the street. He had never done anything like this before. He was a truck driver, not a soldier, not a spy, not any of the things that this moment seemed to require. Daniel must have sensed his fear, because he put a hand on Marcus's shoulder and spoke in a calm, steady voice. He told Marcus that courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was being afraid and doing the thing anyway. He told Marcus that he had seen men with years of training freeze in moments of crisis, and he had seen civilians with no training at all rise to challenges that should have been impossible. What mattered was not what you had done before. What mattered was what you chose to do now. They moved toward the warehouse at exactly 2:17 in the morning, the time when Daniel said the guards would be at their least alert. The fence was old and easy to cut through. The side door was locked, but Daniel had tools for that. Within minutes they were inside, moving through a maze of shelving and crates that smelled of dust and something faintly chemical. The safe was exactly where Elena had said it would be, in a small office at the back of the building. Daniel worked on the lock while Marcus kept watch, his ears straining for any sound that might indicate they had been discovered. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one feeling like an hour, until finally, Daniel gave a soft grunt of satisfaction and the safe door swung open. Inside were stacks of documents, ledgers, photographs, USB drives, and a collection of evidence that would have made any prosecutor weep with joy. They took everything, stuffing it into the duffel bags they had brought, working in silence except for the sound of paper rustling and zippers closing. It was almost too easy, almost too smooth. And that was when Marcus heard the footsteps. They came from the front of the warehouse, multiple sets of feet moving with purpose and speed. Someone had been alerted. Someone knew they were there. Marcus and Daniel exchanged a look that said everything without words, and then they were moving, running toward the back exit that Elena had told them about, the one that led to a loading dock and a fence that was lower than the one they had cut through. They almost made it. They were 10 feet from the door when the lights came on, flooding the warehouse with harsh fluorescent glare that made them both freeze like deer in headlights. A voice cold and amused echoed through the space. It was Dominic Santoro himself. He stepped out from behind a stack of crates, flanked by men who looked like they had been born without the capacity for mercy. He was older than Marcus had expected, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades of decisions that would haunt a normal man. But his eyes were sharp, calculating, utterly devoid of the warmth that separated humans from predators. Santoro told them that he had known they were coming, that Eleanor had always been predictable in her desperation, that this warehouse had been watched ever since she disappeared, just waiting for someone foolish enough to try exactly what Marcus and Daniel had tried. He almost seemed impressed by their audacity. Almost. Marcus felt the world narrowing around him, felt all the hope that had sustained him through the past few days draining away like water through a cracked vessel. They had failed. They had gambled everything and lost, and now they would pay the price, would pay. But Daniel did not look defeated. Daniel looked like a man who had been in worse situations and walked away breathing. He shifted his weight slightly, his hand moving toward the small of his back, where Marcus knew he kept a weapon, and he spoke in a voice that was calm, almost conversational. Daniel told Santoro that they had already made copies, that the records in those bags were not the only copies in existence, that if anything happened to them, to Eleanor, to Sofia, those copies would find their way to every law enforcement agency, every news organization, every rival family that had ever wanted to see Santoro fall. He told Santoro that the only way to keep those records from destroying everything he had built was to let them go, to let Elena go, to let Sofia go, to pretend that none of this had ever happened. It was a bluff. They had not made copies. There had not been time. But Marcus watched Santoro's face and saw something flicker behind those cold eyes. Doubt, calculation, the weighing of risks against rewards that had kept this man alive and in power for half a century. The silence stretched for an eternity. Then Santoro smiled, a thin, humorless expression that did not reach his eyes, and told Daniel that he was either very brave or very stupid. Probably both. He said that he would let them go for now, but that they should never forget that he knew where to find them. That he had a long memory and an even longer reach. That this was not over. It was merely postponed. Marcus and Daniel walked out of that warehouse with the evidence that could bring down an empire, and with the knowledge that they had bought themselves time, nothing more. But time, Marcus realized, was all they had ever really needed. Time to get Eleanor and Sophia to safety. Time to figure out what to do with the information they had risked their lives to obtain. Time to find allies who could help them finish what they had started. As they drove through the pre-dawn streets of Philadelphia, the duffel bags sitting in the back seat like bombs waiting to explode, Marcus looked at his brother and felt something he had not felt in years. Gratitude, pride, the fierce, complicated love that bound siblings together through everything life could throw at them. They had done the impossible. They had walked into the lion's den and walked out again. And whatever came next, they would face it together. Chapter 3. The safe house was a cabin in the Pocono Mountains, 2 hours from Philadelphia, and a world away from the life Elena had known. It had been arranged by one of Daniel's contacts, a woman who asked no questions and expected no answers, and it came stocked with enough supplies to last a month if necessary. When Marcus and Daniel arrived with the evidence from the warehouse, Elena was waiting at the door, Sophia asleep in her arms, her face a mask of fear that only relaxed when she saw them walking toward her in one piece. The next few days were spent in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Santoro's men to appear at the door, for the fragile peace they had built to shatter around them. But the days passed and nothing happened. It was as if Santoro had decided to honor his word, at least for now, while he figured out his next move. During those quiet days in the mountains, Marcus found himself getting to know Eleanor and Sophia in ways that the chaos of the past week had not allowed. He learned that Elena had been a nurse before she married into the Santoro family, that she had dreams of opening a clinic in an underserved community, that she had given up everything she was for a man who had promised her safety and delivered only control. He learned that Sophia loved butterflies and hated the color yellow and had never seen snow, despite living in the Northeast for most of her young life. He also learned things about himself that he had forgotten. He learned that he could still make a child laugh by making silly faces. He learned that he could still feel the warmth of human connection after years of convincing himself that he was better off alone. He learned that the heart, like any muscle, could atrophy from disuse, but it could also be strengthened again with the right kind of exercise. One evening, while Sophia was asleep and Daniel was outside doing a perimeter check that probably was not necessary but made him feel useful, Eleanor sat down next to Marcus on the cabin's small porch. The stars were out, more stars than Marcus had seen in years, and the silence between them was comfortable in a way that silences rarely were. Elena told Marcus that she had been thinking about what would happen next, about where she and Sophia would go once this was over, if it was ever really over. She had family in California, distant cousins who had married out of the organization years ago and had been written off by the Santoro family as traitors. They might take her in, they might not. It was impossible to know until she asked. Marcus listened without interrupting, watching the way the starlight played across her face, thinking about all the roads he had traveled and all the destinations he had reached, and how none of them had ever felt like home. He thought about his wife, about the dreams they had shared, about the family they had planned but never had the chance to build. And he thought about how strange life was, how it could take everything from you and then years later offer you something new, something you had not asked for and did not deserve. He told Elena that he would help her get to California, if that was what she wanted, that he would drive them himself, all the way across the country, using the routes he knew and the contacts he had built over decades of hauling cargo from coast to coast. It would take time and it would not be easy, but he would make sure she and Sophia got there safely. It was a promise, and Marcus had learned that promises were the one thing he could still give that actually meant something. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, and Marcus saw something shift in her eyes, some wall coming down that she had built to protect herself from a world that had given her every reason to keep people at a distance. She told him that she did not know what she had done to deserve someone like him, someone who would risk everything for a stranger, someone who asked for nothing in return. She told him that for years she had believed that men only wanted to own her, to control her, to use her for their own purposes, and that meeting him had shown her that there was another way, that kindness still existed, even in a world that seemed determined to prove otherwise. Marcus did not know what to say to that. He was not good with words, had never been the kind of man who could express his feelings in ways that sounded poetic or profound. So instead, he just reached over and took her hand, a simple gesture that said more than any speech could have conveyed. They sat there on the porch, hand in hand, watching the stars wheel overhead, two broken people who had somehow found each other in the darkness. This is the moment when I need to ask you something important. If this story has touched your heart, if you have felt even a fraction of what Marcus and Elena are feeling right now, then leave a comment saying this exact phrase. Real strength is not about power. It is about protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Let us see how many people understand what true courage really means. The peace of those mountain days could not last forever. On the fifth morning, Daniel's phone buzzed with a message that changed everything. It was from a contact in the FBI, someone Daniel had worked with years ago on a case that neither of them ever talked about. The message said that Santoro was making moves, calling in favors, preparing for something big. It said that they had maybe 72 hours before whatever was coming arrived at their doorstep. It was time to go on the offensive again, this time for good. Daniel had a plan, one that he had been working on since they arrived at the cabin, one that used the evidence from the warehouse not as a defensive weapon, but as a spear aimed directly at the heart of Santoro's empire. But it would require them to trust people they did not know, to put their fate in the hands of institutions that had failed people like them countless times before. The plan was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. They would deliver the evidence to a federal prosecutor in Washington, D.C., someone with a reputation for incorruptibility and a personal grudge against organized crime. This prosecutor had been trying to build a case against the Santoro family for years, but had never had enough evidence to make the charges stick. The records from the warehouse would change that. They would give her everything she needed to bring indictments, to freeze assets, to turn the full weight of the federal government against a man who had spent his life believing he was above the law. But getting to Washington would not be easy. Santoro had eyes everywhere, and he would be expecting them to make a move like this. The roads would be watched. The airports would be watched. Every method of transportation that a normal person might use would be monitored by people who were paid very well to notice things that did not belong. That was where Marcus came in. He knew routes that did not appear on any map, truck stops where cash was king and questions were forbidden, a network of drivers and dispatchers who had helped each other out of tight spots for decades. If anyone could get Eleanor and the evidence to Washington without being detected, it was him. It was what he had been doing his whole life, just with different cargo. They left the cabin before dawn, the four of them packed into Daniel's rental car for the first leg of the journey. The plan was to switch vehicles multiple times, to move in patterns that would be impossible to predict, to use every trick that 2 lifetimes of experience had taught Marcus and Daniel about staying off the radar. It would take 2 days, maybe 3, depending on what obstacles they encountered along the way. The first day passed without incident, a blur of highways and back roads and small towns with names that Marcus would forget as soon as they were in the rearview mirror. Sophia was a trooper, entertaining herself with coloring books and games on a tablet that Daniel had bought at a gas station, only occasionally asking the kind of questions that children ask when they do not understand why their life has suddenly become an adventure movie. Elena sat next to Marcus most of the time, watching the landscape scroll past, lost in thoughts that she did not share. But every now and then she would reach over and touch his arm, a brief contact that said more than words could convey. She was grateful. She was scared. She was hopeful. She was all the things that a person could be when their entire life hung in the balance, and she was sharing those feelings with him in the only way she knew how. On the second night, they stopped at a motel in rural Virginia, the kind of place that still used physical keys and did not ask for identification as long as you paid in advance. Marcus stood guard while the others slept, watching the parking lot through a gap in the curtains, his mind racing with all the ways this could still go wrong. It was during those quiet hours that he allowed himself to think about the future, about what might happen after they delivered the evidence and Santoro's empire began to crumble. Would Elena really go to California? To those distant cousins who might or might not welcome her with open arms? Would he go back to driving his roots, to the empty apartment, to the life that had felt like dying slowly before that rainy night on the highway? The thought of returning to that existence, To the silence and the solitude and the endless miles of road that led nowhere meaningful felt almost physically painful. He had tasted something different now. He had remembered what it felt like to have a purpose beyond survival, to care about people who cared about him in return. How could he go back to what he had been, knowing what he could be? But these were questions for another time, for a future that they had not yet earned. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting through the next 24 hours, getting to Washington, getting that evidence into the right hands. Everything else would have to wait. Chapter 4. They reached Washington on the afternoon of the third day, exhausted, paranoid, and more hopeful than any of them had a right to be. The city rose up around them like a promise, all marble monuments and wide avenues, and the accumulated weight of a nation's history. Somewhere in this city was a woman who could turn the evidence in their trunk into the weapon that would bring down Dominic Santoro. All they had to do was find her and trust that she would do the right thing. The prosecutor's name was Catherine Chen, and she worked out of an office in a building that looked like every other government building in the district. Daniel had made contact through back channels, setting up a meeting that was not on any official schedule and would not appear in any official records. She had agreed to see them, but she had made no promises beyond that. In this town, promises were currency, and she was not going to spend hers until she knew exactly what she was buying. They left Elena and Sophia at a hotel on the outskirts of the city, guarded by two of Daniel's associates who had arrived during the night. It was not ideal, but it was the best protection they could arrange on short notice, and it kept the two of them away from the danger that the next few hours might bring. Marcus did not like leaving them, felt physically ill at the thought of not being there if something went wrong, but he knew that his presence at the meeting was essential. He was the one who had started this. He needed to be the one who finished it. The meeting took place in a conference room with no windows, fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill, and a table covered with the documents they had risked their lives to obtain. Catherine Chen was younger than Marcus had expected, maybe early 40s with sharp eyes, and the kind of careful expressionlessness that came from years of playing poker with criminals who had everything to lose. She listened without interrupting, as Daniel laid out the evidence, explained how they had obtained it, described the threat that Santoro posed, not just to Elena and Sophia, but to the entire fabric of legitimate business along the eastern seaboard. She asked questions that were pointed and specific, questions that showed she understood exactly what she was looking at and exactly how valuable it was. And when Daniel finished his presentation, she sat back in her chair and looked at them with an expression that Marcus could not read. She told them that what they had brought her was enough to open an investigation, maybe even enough to secure indictments. But she also told them that Santoro had survived investigations before. He had lawyers who charged more per hour than most people made in a month, contacts in places that she could not talk about, and a network of influence that extended into corners of government that were supposed to be beyond corruption. Taking him down would not be a simple matter of presenting evidence and waiting for justice to prevail. It would be a war, fought in courtrooms and boardrooms and back rooms, a war that could take years and might never produce the outcome they were hoping for. But, she added, it was a war worth fighting. And she was willing to fight it if they were willing to provide what she needed to sustain the battle. That meant testimony, formal statements, a willingness to go on record with everything they knew and how they knew it. It meant putting themselves in the crosshairs, not just of Santoro, but of a legal process that could be just as grinding and merciless as any criminal organization. Marcus thought about what she was asking, about the risk she was describing, about the years of uncertainty and danger that lay ahead if they agreed to her terms. He thought about Elena and Sophia, about the life they could have if they just walked away and disappeared into the vastness of the American heartland. He thought about his own peace, his own safety, his own desire to be done with all of this and return to something resembling normalcy. And then he thought about the man who had called him on that phone in Tennessee, the cold voice that had promised consequences, the casual arrogance of someone who believed he was untouchable. He thought about all the other women and children who had suffered because men like Santoro were allowed to operate in the shadows, protected by money and power, and the cowardice of people who knew the truth but were too afraid to speak it. He told Catherine Chen that he was in, that he would testify, make statements, do whatever was required to see this through to the end. Daniel said the same thing, and Marcus could tell from the look in his brother's eyes that this was not just a professional decision, but a personal one. They were committed now, all of them, to a path that had no guarantee of success, but at least had the virtue of being right. The meeting ended with handshakes and promises that somehow felt more substantial than the ones Marcus was used to. They would be in touch, Catherine said. There would be depositions, interviews, preparations for the legal battles to come. It would not be quick and it would not be easy, but if they stayed the course, there was a real chance that Santoro would finally face the justice that had eluded him for so long. Walking out of that building into the Washington afternoon, Marcus felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. They had done it. They had set in motion something that could not be stopped, a process that was now bigger than any of them individually. Whatever happened next, they had done something that mattered. They had stood up to power and refused to be intimidated, and that, in itself, was a victory. The drive back to the hotel was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts about what the future might hold. When they arrived, Eleanor was waiting in the lobby, Sophia playing with a pile of blocks that someone had found to keep her entertained. The look on Elena's face when she saw Marcus walk through the door was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. It was relief and hope and something deeper, something that looked almost like love but might have been too early to call by that name. That night in the hotel restaurant, they had their first real meal since leaving the cabin in the Poconos. It was nothing fancy, just burgers and fries and milkshakes that Sophia declared to be the best she had ever tasted, but it felt like a celebration, a recognition of everything they had survived and everything they had accomplished. They were not out of danger yet, might never be completely out of danger, but they were together, and for now, that was enough. After dinner, while Daniel took Sophia to find a vending machine that she had spotted earlier, Elena and Marcus found themselves alone on a bench in the hotel courtyard. The night was cool but not cold, the kind of early spring evening that made you believe that good things were still possible, in a world that often seemed determined to prove otherwise. Eleanor told Marcus that she had been thinking about California, about those distant cousins, about the future she had imagined for herself and Sophia. She told him that she was not sure that future was what she wanted anymore, that somewhere in the chaos of the past week, somewhere between the rain-soaked highway and this quiet courtyard, something had changed. Marcus asked her what had changed. Elena looked at him with those dark eyes that he had first seen in the wreckage of an SUV in Tennessee, eyes that had been so filled with fear then, and were now filled with something entirely different. She told him that she had found something she had stopped believing was possible. She had found someone who saw her not as a possession or a problem, but as a person. Someone who risked everything without asking for anything in return. Someone who made her feel safe not through control, but through compassion. She told him that she did not want to go to California alone, that she wanted him to come with her, not as a protector or a driver, but as a partner, as someone who would build a new life alongside her and Sophia, a life free from the shadows of the past and open to possibilities that she was only now beginning to imagine. Marcus felt his heart expand in a way that he had thought was no longer possible. He thought about his wife, about the love they had shared, and the future they had planned, and he realized that she would have wanted this for him. She would have wanted him to find happiness again, to stop driving in circles and start driving towards something that mattered. She would have wanted him to be brave, not just in the face of danger, but in the face of love. He told Elena that he would go with her, that he did not know what the future held, but he knew that he wanted to face it together, that maybe, after all these years, he had finally found the destination he had been looking for, without even knowing he was searching. They sat together on that bench, two people who had started as strangers and had become something much more, watching the stars appear one by one in the Washington sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new uncertainties, but tonight, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, they felt at peace. Chapter 5. The months that followed were a patchwork of legal proceedings, relocation protocols, and the slow, painstaking process of building a new life. Catherine Chen proved to be everything she had promised, and more, assembling a case against Dominic Santoro that made national headlines and sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. The evidence from the warehouse was exactly as damning as Elena had believed, documenting decades of illegal activity that made conviction not just possible, but inevitable. Santoro fought back, of course, deploying armies of lawyers and mounting a defense that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. But the evidence was overwhelming, the testimony was consistent, and the tide of public opinion had turned against him in ways that his money could not buy back. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, Marcus was in the courtroom, seated between Elena and Daniel, watching justice finally catch up with a man who had believed himself untouchable. The sentencing hearing was held 2 months later, in the same courtroom where the verdict had been announced. Santoro was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole, his assets frozen, his empire dismantled piece by investigators who had finally been given the tools to do what they had always wanted to do. It was not perfect justice, could never fully compensate for all the lives that Santoro had destroyed over the decades, but it was something. It was a start. Elena was there for the sentencing, Sophia safely with a babysitter at the apartment they had rented in Northern California, while all of this was playing out. She watched Santoro being led away in handcuffs, watched the door close behind him, watched the end of a chapter that had defined her life for far too long, and when it was over, she turned to Marcus with tears streaming down her face and told him that she felt like she could finally breathe for the first time in years. They flew back to California that evening, to the small town outside of Sacramento, where Eleanor's cousins had welcomed them with open arms and no judgment. The house they had found was nothing like the mansions and penthouses of her old life. It was modest, a bit worn around the edges with a backyard that needed work and plumbing that made alarming sounds in the middle of the night. But it was theirs, free and clear, purchased with the savings Marcus had accumulated over decades of hauling cargo across the country. The clinic that Elena had dreamed of was still years away, but she was taking steps toward it, enrolling in courses to update her nursing credentials, volunteering at a local community health center, building the network of contacts and supporters that would one day make her dream a reality. Sophia had started school, had made friends, had finally gotten to see snow on a vacation to Lake Tahoe that Marcus had organized as a surprise. And Marcus himself. He was learning what it meant to live a life that was not defined by movement, to put down roots after decades of believing that home was whatever highway he happened to be on. He had sold his truck, had let go of the roots and the contacts and the endless miles that had once been everything to him. In their place, he had found something that he had thought was lost forever, a family. He and Eleanor were married on a spring afternoon in the backyard of their modest house, surrounded by her cousins, by Daniel and his wife, by a handful of neighbors who had become friends in the short time they had lived there. Sophia was the flower girl, scattering petals with the serious concentration of a child who understood that this moment mattered even if she did not fully understand why. The ceremony was simple, the vows were sincere, and when Marcus kissed his bride for the first time as her husband, he felt something that he had thought he would never feel again. He felt complete. He felt home. He felt like the man he had always wanted to be but had been too afraid to become. The reception lasted until sunset, with laughter and dancing, and the kind of warmth that came from being surrounded by people who genuinely cared about your happiness. Daniel gave a toast that made Marcus cry, talking about the brother who had always been there for him and who had finally found the courage to be there for himself. Eleanor's cousin spoke about second chances and new beginnings and the way that life sometimes took you to exactly where you needed to be, even when you were convinced you were lost. That night, after the guests had gone home, and Sophia was asleep in her room, surrounded by stuffed animals that Marcus had won at a county fair, Helena and Marcus sat on their front porch and watched the stars come out. It had become their ritual, this quiet time together at the end of each day, a reminder of that first night on the cabin porch when everything between them had changed. Elena told Marcus that she still could not believe this was her life, that she still woke up some mornings expecting to find herself back in the old world, trapped and terrified and alone, that it took her a moment, every single day, to remember that she was free, that she was safe, that she was loved. Marcus understood exactly what she meant. He had felt the same way for months after his wife died, waking up and reaching for a presence that was no longer there, adjusting to an absence that felt like a physical wound. But now, when he woke up and reached out, someone was there. Someone who had chosen him, who trusted him, who saw him not as a broken man, but as someone worth rebuilding a life with. He told Elena that he had spent 3 years driving in circles, going through the motions of a life that had lost its meaning. He told her that on that rainy night in Tennessee, when he pulled over to help a stranger, he had no idea that he was actually saving himself. He told her that she and Sophia had given him something he had given up on finding, a reason to stay instead of a reason to keep moving. They sat together in the quiet of the evening, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, two survivors who had learned that strength was not about never being broken, but about having the courage to put the pieces back together. The road behind them was long and marked with pain, but the road ahead stretched out full of possibility, illuminated by the love they had built together. Chapter 6. 5 years later, the clinic finally opened. It was a modest building on the edge of town, painted in the warm earth tones that Elena had always loved, with a small garden in front, where patients could sit and wait in the fresh air. The sign above the door read, Webb Family Health Center, a tribute to the name that Elena had taken when she married Marcus, and to the family they had created together. The opening ceremony was attended by local officials, by the community members who would be served by the clinic, and by a collection of people who had traveled from across the country to celebrate this moment. Daniel was there with his family. Catherine Chen, who had become a friend as well as an ally over the years, made the trip from Washington. Even some of the truck drivers Marcus had known in his old life showed up, rough men with soft hearts who slapped him on the back and told him they always knew he had it in him. Sophia, now 11 years old, cut the ribbon with oversized scissors, beaming with pride at being given such an important task. She had grown into a confident, curious girl, interested in science and art, and the thousand other things that captured the attention of children her age. The trauma of her early years had faded, replaced by memories of safety and love, and the knowledge that she was surrounded by people who would always protect her. Marcus stood in the crowd, watching his wife deliver the speech she had been preparing for weeks. She spoke about the importance of community health, about the barriers that too many people faced when trying to access care, about her dream of creating a place where everyone would be treated with dignity, regardless of their ability to pay. She spoke about second chances and the power of belief, and the way that one moment of kindness could change the trajectory of an entire life. She did not mention the Mafia, or the warehouse, or the terrifying weeks when their survival had hung by a thread. Those stories were known to the people who needed to know them. But they were not what this day was about. Today was about looking forward, not back. Today was about celebrating what they had built together, brick by brick, and patient by patient, and day by day. After the ceremony, after the handshakes and the photographs and the promises to schedule appointments, Marcus found himself alone in the garden, looking at the building that his wife had dreamed of for so many years. He thought about the night they had met, the rain and the crash, and the split-second decision that had changed everything. He thought about all the moments since then, the fear and the hope and the love that had grown between them like a plant reaching toward the sun. Elena found him there, slipping her hand into his with the natural ease of a gesture they had made 1,000 times before. She asked him what he was thinking about. Marcus smiled and told her that he was thinking about roads, about how he had spent most of his life on them, convinced that the destination did not matter as long as he kept moving. And about how wrong he had been. The real journey, he had learned, was not about covering distance. It was about finding the people who made you want to stop. It was about building something that would last longer than any highway, something that would still be standing when the roads themselves had crumbled to dust. Helena leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood together in the garden as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. 5 years ago, they had been strangers caught in a storm. Now they were partners, parents, the architects of a life that neither of them had imagined was possible. The road that had brought them here was behind them now, a story that had become family legend, retold at holidays and anniversaries and quiet moments when they needed to remind themselves how far they had come. But the road ahead was still unwritten, still full of possibilities, still waiting to be traveled together. Sophia came running across the garden, excited about something she had discovered inside the clinic, a butterfly that had somehow found its way through an open window. She grabbed both of their hands and pulled them toward the building, toward the future they were creating one day at a time. Marcus let himself be led, smiling at his daughter's enthusiasm, at his wife's laughter, at the simple joy of being exactly where he was supposed to be. A truck driver who had faced down a Mafia boss and discovered that the greatest adventure was not on the highway, but in the human heart. Nothing had been the same after that night in the rain. And he would not have had it any other way. If you have watched this far, it is because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I have watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. Your comment means more than you know. It tells me that these stories matter, that they reach someone, that the hours spent crafting them are worth every second. And if this story touched your heart, if it made you believe, even for a moment, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, then please leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Every like, Every share, every comment helps this story reach someone who might be going through their own storm, someone who needs to know that there is hope on the other side. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this community that believes in the power of stories to change lives. Until next time, remember, the road ahead is always full of possibilities. All you have to do is have the courage to take the first step.